The Jothic Concordat had been the undisputed rulers of the Outer Spiral for over 3,000 years. During that time, they had conquered and crushed dozens of alien species under their iron fist. Their military machine was legendary, feared across countless star systems. When they turned their attention to a small blue planet called Earth, they expected another easy victory to add to their long list of conquests. The initial reconnaissance reports made the Jothic commanders almost laugh out loud. These humans, as they called themselves, were still using primitive nuclear weapons. Their planet was divided into hundreds of competing nations that could barely agree on anything. Their resource distribution was shockingly inefficient, with some areas hoarding wealth while others starved. To the advanced Jothic, it looked like a civilization that was barely holding itself together. The War Council didn't even bother sending their best fleet. They figured a standard invasion force would be more than enough to bring these primitive creatures to their knees. Commander Veshin sat in his command chair aboard the flagship, watching Earth grow larger on the view screen. He had personally overseen the subjugation of 6 different species. This would be his 7th and by far the easiest. He activated the communication systems and broadcast the standard ultimatum that the Concordat had used for centuries. His translator converted his words into the dominant human languages. The message was simple and direct. Surrender within 72 hours or face complete annihilation. Submit to Concordat rule, and your species would be allowed to survive as servants. Resist, and they would be wiped from existence. What came back confused Veshinke more than anything in his long military career. First, there was laughter. Actual laughter coming through the communication channels. Then a human voice, belonging to someone named Jack Reynolds, came through crystal clear. The human spoke with an almost casual tone, like he was talking to an old friend rather than an alien invasion force. "You sure about that?" was all he said before the line went dead. Veshinke felt a flicker of annoyance, but dismissed it as typical primitive bravado. Surely when they saw the power of the Concordat fleet, they would understand their mistake. He waited patiently for the 72 hours to expire, expecting messages of surrender to flood in at any moment. But none came. The humans went about their daily lives as if nothing was happening. Some of their news networks even made jokes about the alien invasion. The audacity was almost impressive. When the deadline passed, Veshinike gave the order he had given many times before: orbital bombardment of major population centers. Show them that resistance was futile. His weapons officers locked onto targets across the planet: New York, Beijing, London, Moscow, Tokyo. The major human cities would be reduced to ash within minutes. He raised his hand to give the final command. That's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Earth's moon, that barren gray rock that had been orbiting the planet for billions of years, suddenly changed. Massive sections of the lunar surface began to shift and slide away. Veshinke stared in disbelief as enormous weapons emerged from beneath the disguised surface. These weren't primitive weapons. These were railgun batteries, each one the size of a building, and they were all pointed directly at his fleet. In a command center buried deep beneath the lunar surface, Captain Emily Parker had been watching the Jothic fleet since the moment they entered the solar system. She had been waiting for this moment her entire career. Humanity had spent decades preparing for first contact, and they had always assumed the worst. The weapons surrounding her had been built in secret, funded by black-budget programs that officially didn't exist. Mining operations on the moon had been the perfect cover. While the public thought humans were just digging up rocks and ice, they had actually been building the most advanced defensive system ever conceived. Emily didn't hesitate when she saw the Jothic fleet preparing to fire on Earth. She pressed the communication button and gave the order that would change galactic history. Fire everything. The lunar railguns opened fire simultaneously. Tungsten projectiles, each weighing several tons, launched at speeds that approached a significant fraction of the speed of light. The vacuum of space filled with streaks of metal moving, so fast they were almost invisible. The Jothic shields, designed to stop energy weapons and conventional missiles, might as well have been made of paper. The relativistic projectiles punched through ships like they weren't even there. Veshineke watched his forward battle group vanish in seconds. Ships that had cost billions to build and decades to construct simply ceased to exist. Explosions bloomed in space as reactors overloaded and ammunition stores detonated. Before he could even process what was happening, Earth's surface came alive. What the Jathic had thought were cities and industrial centers suddenly revealed their true nature. Camouflaged military installations opened up across every continent. Hidden weapon platforms rose from the oceans. Satellites that the aliens had dismissed as primitive communication devices suddenly activated targeting systems. The orbital defense grid that lit up around Earth was more sophisticated than anything Concordat had ever encountered. Veshenke felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: fear. The Jathic had made a fundamental mistake. They had assumed that humanity's fractured governments and apparent inefficiency meant weakness. They couldn't have been more wrong. Humans weren't unified because they agreed on everything. They were unified because they all agreed on one thing: nobody else was going to tell them what to do. And they certainly weren't honest about their capabilities. Why would they advertise their best weapons to potential enemies? As Veshenke ordered a full retreat, his ships taking heavy casualties, he realized the Concordat had just made the biggest military blunder in their 3,000-year history. They hadn't attacked a primitive species. They had attacked a species that had been preparing for war since they first looked up at the stars. The Concordat's high command assembled in their war room on the homeworld, thousands of light years from Earth. The massive holographic display showed the remains of their forward fleet, or what little was left of it. 12 capital ships destroyed. Dozens more damaged beyond repair. Thousands of trained soldiers dead. The room fell silent as the admirals and generals processed what they were seeing. In 3,000 years of conquest, they had never lost so many ships in a single engagement. Grand Admiral Theknor slammed his appendage on the table. This was unacceptable. These primitive humans had gotten lucky, nothing more. They had clearly been hiding their defensive capabilities. But defense was one thing. Offense was entirely different. The Concordat would show them what real military power looked like. He ordered the deployment of the 3rd and 5th Assault Fleets. Over 300 warships carry enough firepower to literally crack a planet's crust and turn its surface into molten glass. Surely, when the humans saw this armada approaching, they would understand the futility of resistance and surrender. The fleets arrived at Earth's solar system in a massive show of force. Veshenke, still recovering from the humiliation of the first battle, watched from a safe distance this time. He expected to see humanity surrender broadcast within hours. Instead, what happened next defied everything the Jathic thought they knew about warfare. The humans didn't have a single unified response. There was no central command making all the decisions. Instead, the Concordat encountered something they had never seen before: distributed warfare on a scale that seemed impossible. Every human nation began fighting independently. The Americans launched attacks from one direction, the Russians from another, the Chinese coordinated strikes from a third angle. The Europeans formed their own battle groups. Even smaller nations that the Jathic had barely noticed were contributing whatever they could. But it wasn't just governments. Human corporations that built spaceships suddenly became part of the war effort. A luxury space yacht, the kind rich humans use for pleasure cruises, showed up with retrofitted alien weapons that had been stolen from the first battle. The ship's owner, a billionaire named Trevor Walsh, had apparently spent the last 72 hours bolting Jathic energy cannons onto his vessel. Mining ships that humans use to extract resources from asteroids suddenly became weapons. Their industrial equipment, designed to break apart rocks, made excellent improvised mass drivers. One mining captain named Bob Eachin used his ship's drilling laser to cut a Concordat destroyer clean in half. The chaos was overwhelming. The Jathic fleet tried to establish control, but there was no central point to attack. Destroy one group of human ships, and 5 more appear from different directions. The Concordat's military doctrine, refined over millennia, was built around destroying an enemy's command structure and forcing surrender. But the humans didn't have a command structure in the traditional sense. They were coordinating somehow, but in a loose, organic way that made no sense to the rigid Jathic military mind. Then things got even stranger. Jathic communication channels started getting flooded with bizarre transmissions. At first, the commanders thought it was some kind of electronic warfare attack. But when they analyzed the data, They discovered it was coming from human civilians. Teenagers, specifically. Young humans who had somehow hacked into military-grade Concordat communication systems and were now filling the channels with what they called memes. Strange images with text that mocked the Jothic. Videos of their ships being destroyed set to upbeat music. Psychological warfare, delivered by children who thought it was funny. One Jothic communications officer had a breakdown trying to filter out an endless stream of videos showing dancing humans with text that read, "You came to the wrong neighborhood." Another found their tactical display replaced with an image of a human in sunglasses with the words "Deal with it." The hackers, led by a 17-year-old named Tyler Brooks, were having the time of their lives while simultaneously degrading Concordat military effectiveness. But the real horror began when human soldiers started boarding damaged Jothic vessels. The Concordat's troops were professional soldiers, trained to the highest standards. They followed military doctrine perfectly. They used proper formation, maintained communication discipline, and fought with honor according to the rules of warfare that had been established across the galaxy. They expected their enemies to do the same. Human Marines were nothing like that. Sergeant Mike Davis led his squad through a captured Concordat cruiser using tactics that would have gotten him court-martialed in any civilized military. He set booby traps in corridors, rigging doors to explode when opened. He ordered fake retreats to lure Jothic soldiers into ambushes. When his team ran out of ammunition, they fought with whatever they could find, using pieces of broken equipment as clubs. One of his Marines, wounded so badly that any sane soldier would have surrendered, continued fighting by crawling through ventilation shafts and dropping grenades on unsuspecting enemies below. The Jothic soldiers were trained to be brave, but they expected their enemies to fight rationally. Humans didn't seem to understand the concept of a rational fight. They attacked from unexpected angles. They used the ship's own systems against its crew, venting atmosphere or overloading power conduits. They showed no fear, even when outnumbered and outgunned. Lieutenant Rachel Foster's final act became legendary among both humans and Jothic. Her boarding team had been caught in an explosive decompression when the Concordat crew deliberately breached their own hull to expel the invaders. Rachel lost both legs in the blast and was sucking vacuum. Any rational being would have died immediately or at least given up. Instead, she used her remaining strength to crawl through the damaged corridor, dragging herself along with just her arms. She made it to the ship's reactor core and manually triggered an overload. The entire cruiser exploded, taking 300 Jothic crew with it. Her suit's communication system transmitted her last words back to human command. "Worth it." The Concordat commanders, reviewing the battle footage, sat in stunned silence. One of them finally spoke what they were all thinking. These humans weren't soldiers in any sense the Jothic understood. They were something far more terrifying. Humans were persistence hunters who had evolved by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They were apex predators who had climbed to the top of their planet's food chain through sheer stubbornness and refusal to quit. And now they had access to starships and military technology. The Concordat had started a war with a species that didn't know how to give up. That realization sent a chill through every commander in the room. News of the war between the Jothic Concordat and humanity spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The faster-than-light communication relays carried the story to every corner of known space within days. At first, most alien species reacted with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Another primitive civilization had apparently angered the mighty Concordat and would soon be crushed into dust. It was a story they had all heard before. The galactic community gave humanity maybe 2 or 3 weeks before complete annihilation. Some species even started placing bets on exactly how long the humans would last. The Verithin Collective received the news with different emotions. For over 500 years, they had lived under Jothic oppression. Their home worlds were technically independent, but everyone knew the truth. The Concordat controlled their trade, their military, their very way of life. Any attempt at rebellion had been crushed immediately and brutally. The Verithin had learned to keep their heads down and accept their fate. But now, watching the reports of human resistance, something stirred in their hearts. Something they hadn't felt in centuries. Hope. They didn't dare act on it yet, but they watched every update from Earth with desperate tension. The crystalline SH War had a very different reaction. For thousands of years, they had maintained strict neutrality in all galactic conflicts. Their species existed as observers, recording history, but never participating in it. They had no enemies and no allies. They simply watched and documented everything. But as they began analyzing the combat footage from the Human-Jathic War, their concern grew. These humans fought in ways that violated every established rule of civilized warfare. They showed a creativity and unpredictability that was frankly disturbing. The SH War began to wonder if they were witnessing the emergence of something unprecedented in galactic history. 3 months into the war, something happened that shocked every species in the galaxy. Humanity went on the offensive, not with a single massive battle fleet, like the Concordat would have used, but with thousands upon thousands of small strike forces. Each one operated independently, hitting targets and disappearing before the enemy could respond. It was like fighting a swarm of insects instead of a proper military force. Commander James Holland became the face of this new type of warfare. A former special operations officer, he had spent years thinking about how to fight an enemy with superior numbers and technology. His answer was simple: don't let them use those advantages. He led raids deep into Concordat space, targeting supply depots that the Jathic thought were completely safe. His ships would appear out of nowhere, destroy their targets, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. When the Concordat tried to track him down, they found he was already attacking somewhere else, hundreds of light years away. The humans had reverse-engineered wormhole technology from captured Jathic ships, but they hadn't just copied it. They had modified it in ways the original designers never imagined. The Concordat used wormholes for transportation, creating stable tunnels through space-time that allowed ships to travel vast distances instantly. Humans looked at that technology and asked a very human question: what if we weaponized it? They started opening wormholes inside enemy ships, venting their atmosphere into space. They opened wormholes near Concordat facilities and used them to redirect asteroids at near light speed. One particularly creative human, engineer, named Danny Rodriguez, figured out how to open a wormhole for just a fraction of a second, long enough to drop a nuclear warhead inside an enemy vessel's reactor room. The Jathic had possessed this technology for centuries and never thought to use it as a weapon. Humans had it for 3 months and found a dozen different ways to kill with it. Human strike forces began appearing everywhere simultaneously. Supply convoys disappeared. Military outposts went silent. Colony worlds found their orbital defenses destroyed overnight. The Concordat military command was going crazy trying to fend everything at once. They had never faced an enemy that could be in 100 places at the same time. Their doctrine was built around big fleet battles where superior numbers and firepower would win. But the humans refused to fight that kind of battle. Then Earth's Unified Defense Command made a bold move. Admiral Robert Price, who had been appointed to lead humanity's war effort, sent an encrypted message to the Verithin Collective. The message was short and simple: we know what they did to you. Join us. It included detailed intelligence on Jathic military positions, weapon specifications, and tactical weaknesses. Everything the Verithin would need to strike back at their oppressors. The Verithin leadership debated for 3 days. This was a tremendous risk. If they rebelled and failed, the Concordat would exterminate their entire species. But if they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. The humans had proven something incredible. The Jathic could be beaten. Finally, the decision was made. The Verithin would fight. Within a week, a dozen other oppressed species made the same choice. The Mekler, the Thandros, the Quellan, all of them had suffered under Concordat rule for generations. All of them had been waiting for someone to show them it was possible to resist. Humanity had given them the hope, and now they were ready to fight for their freedom. Rebellions erupted across Concordat space. Supply worlds refused to send resources. Military units composed of subject species turned on their Jathic officers. Entire sectors descended into chaos. The Jathic Empire, which had stood unchallenged for 3,000 years, suddenly found itself fighting wars on 17 different fronts simultaneously. Their military, designed to crush single opponents one at a time, couldn't cope with this level of distributed conflict. Every time they deployed forces to suppress one rebellion, two more would erupt somewhere else. The humans had done more than just defend themselves. They had sparked a galactic revolution. The crystalline HFY War observers made an unprecedented decision. For the first time in their recorded history, they sent a diplomatic envoy to another species during an active war. They needed to understand what humanity was before the galaxy changed forever. Ambassador Diane Morgan met the HFY War delegation at a neutral space station. The crystalline beings asked their questions through harmonic vibrations translated into human language. They wanted to know what made humans so different, so dangerous, so effective at warfare. Diane thought for a moment, then smiled. We're the species that looked at persistence hunting and thought, yeah, but what if we did it with spaceships? The HFY War didn't fully understand the joke, but they recognized the truth in it. Humans were evolved hunters who never gave up on prey. And now, they were hunting an empire. The Concordat High Council gathered in their most secure facility, deep beneath the surface of their home world. The council chamber, which had witnessed 3,000 years of triumphant military reports, now echoed with desperation and fear. The holographic displays surrounding them told a story of complete disaster. 30% of their total fleet was gone, not damaged, not in repair, but completely destroyed. Their economy, which had been built on the tribute and resources from conquered worlds, was collapsing. Subject species were rebelling everywhere. Supply lines were cut. Production facilities were being sabotaged. But what truly terrified the council members was something they couldn't measure or quantify. They simply did not understand how humans thought about war. The Concordat's military philosophy was straightforward. Conquer territory, control resources, force surrender through superior firepower. Every species they had ever fought followed similar logic. You won battles, you took ground, you established control. But humans seemed to be playing an entirely different game, one the Jothic didn't know the rules to. Humans didn't just fight to win battles. They fought to break their enemies' will to continue fighting. They understood that wars were won in the minds of soldiers and civilians, not just on battlefields. Every human military action seemed designed to demoralize, to create doubt, to make the Jothic question whether continuing this war was worth the cost. And it was working terrifyingly well. Colonel David Wright ran what humans call their Psychological Operations Division. His job wasn't to destroy Concordat ships, though he was happy when that happened. His job was to destroy Concordat morale. He led a team that had somehow hacked into Jothic news networks across their entire empire. Every day, Concordat citizens turned on their information feeds, expecting to hear about glorious victories. Instead, they saw footage of their ships being torn apart. They saw interviews with captured Jothic soldiers who looked exhausted and confused. They saw human commanders explaining, in perfectly translated Jothic language, exactly how they were going to win this war. The Concordat government tried to shut down the hacked broadcasts, but every time they closed one channel, Wright's team opened 5 more. They had infiltrated so deep into Concordat communications infrastructure that removing them would mean shutting down the entire network. The propaganda was relentless and everywhere. Jothic citizens began asking questions their government couldn't answer. Why were they fighting this war? What were they gaining? How many more of their sons and daughters would die for this pointless conquest? Captain Jennifer Lee came up with something even more psychologically devastating. She started sending care packages to Concordat soldiers on the front lines. At first, the military commanders thought they were bombs or biological weapons. They had the packages carefully scanned and examined. What they found inside confused them completely. Letters. Personal letters from the soldiers' own families back home. The humans had somehow intercepted private Concordat communications and were now delivering mail to their enemies. Jothic soldiers opened these packages and found messages from their mates and offspring. Letters talking about daily life, expressing worry, asking when they would come home. Some letters mentioned how the war was affecting their families, how resources were being rationed, how schools were closing because teachers were being drafted, how grandmother had died and they couldn't afford a proper memorial because all the family's credits were going to war taxes. The humans weren't trying to trick these soldiers or recruit them as spies. They were just reminding them what they were fighting for, and more importantly, what they were missing while they fought. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had been perfectly willing to die for the Concordat's glory started wondering if maybe they should just go home instead. Desertion rates began climbing. Some units refused orders to attack. A few even surrendered voluntarily, asking the humans to please just send them home. Then the humans did something completely bizarre that somehow worked. They started broadcasting human entertainment across Concordat space. Television shows, movies, music, all of it carefully translated. At first, the Jothic government thought this was just noise meant to jam their communications. Then their citizens started actually watching this stuff, and it began changing how they thought about everything. One human show about workers in a coffee shop became hugely popular in Concordat space. The Jothic watched, fascinated, as human service workers were treated with respect and dignity. They saw a society where different types of people worked together as equals, where authority figures could be questioned and challenged, where individual choice mattered more than social hierarchy. These concepts were revolutionary to the rigid, hierarchical Concordat society. Young Jothic especially started asking dangerous questions. Why couldn't their society work this way? Why did they have to follow orders without question? What if there was a better way to live? General William Clark coordinated what became known as Operation Prometheus. The name came from an old human myth about giving fire to primitive peoples. But this operation wasn't about fire. It was about giving oppressed species throughout Concordat space the tools they needed to free themselves. Human vessels, protected by military escorts, began appearing at rebel-held worlds. They weren't carrying weapons or soldiers. They were carrying something far more dangerous, manufacturing equipment and educational materials. Major Tom Bennett led many of these liberation missions. He watched as humans taught the Verithin how to build their own advanced weapons. They showed the Meckler how to manufacture medical supplies and food production systems. They gave the Thandros access to educational databases that would have taken them centuries to develop on their own. The humans weren't conquering these worlds or demanding tribute. They were uplifting them, making them stronger, giving them the ability to stand on their own. Within months, the nature of the rebellions changed completely. At first, the Concordat had faced angry mobs with primitive weapons. Dangerous, yes, but manageable with superior military technology. Now they face rebellions armed with weapons nearly as advanced as their own, fed by self-sufficient agriculture, educated and organized. The Concordat couldn't just crush these uprisings anymore. They had to actually fight for every planet, and they were losing. The final humiliation came from an unexpected source. Kevin Murphy was a civilian contractor, a hacker who had been hired by the human military to help with electronic warfare. He assembled a team of the best cyber warfare specialists humanity had, along with some talented amateurs who just enjoyed the challenge. Their target was the Concordat's central AI network, which controlled everything from military logistics to civilian administration. The Concordat had spent centuries building the system. It was supposed to be unhackable, protected by the most advanced security protocols. Kevin's team broke through in 6 weeks. Once inside, they did something so simple, it was almost insulting. They changed all the administrative passwords, every single one, and they changed them all to variations of password 123. The chaos was immediate and total. Concordat bureaucrats couldn't access their own systems. Military supply officers couldn't process requisitions. Tax collectors couldn't collect taxes. Traffic control systems in major cities stopped working. The entire administrative machinery of a 3,000-year-old empire ground to a halt. It took them weeks to regain control, and even then, they kept finding backdoors Kevin's team had left behind. The humans could shut them down again anytime they wanted. 18 months after the Jothic Concordat had confidently arrived at Earth, expecting an easy conquest, their High Council did something they had never done in 3,000 years of military dominance. They sued for peace. The message came through official diplomatic channels, and its tone was very different from the arrogant ultimatum they had broadcast at the start of the war. This time, the Jothic were begging. Their empire was collapsing. Their military was shattered. Their economy was in ruins. They had no choice but to surrender on whatever terms humanity would accept. The peace conference was held on a neutral space station that had been hastily constructed for the occasion. Representatives from the newly formed Terran coalition and allied species gathered to dictate the terms. The Concordat negotiators arrived expecting the usual post-war arrangements. Territory would be exchanged, some reparations would be paid, and life would go on mostly as before. They were completely unprepared for what humanity had in mind. The terms were unprecedented in galactic history. The Concordat would completely dismantle its offensive military capability. They could keep defensive forces to protect their own worlds, but their war machine would be broken apart and scattered. They would pay massive reparations, not just to humanity, but to every species they had oppressed over the centuries. The funds would go toward rebuilding worlds they had damaged and compensating families they had destroyed. Most shocking of all, Concordat leadership would submit to war crimes tribunals. Individual Jothic who had committed atrocities would be held personally accountable. The concept of personal responsibility for wartime actions was radical in galactic politics, where leaders usually escaped consequences for their decisions. But the most important term was simple. Every species that had been subjugated by the Concordat would receive complete independence immediately. No gradual transition, no continued oversight, just freedom. And humanity would provide technological assistance to help these newly independent species stand on their own. The humans weren't replacing the Concordat as the new galactic overlords. They were dismantling the entire system of domination. The peace conference itself was absolute chaos, but in a very human way. Humanity had insisted that every affected species must have representation at the negotiations. That meant over 40 different delegations, each with wildly different biologies, communication methods, and social structures. The Verithin breathed methane and had to stay in special environmental suits. The crystalline HFY communicated through harmonic vibrations. The Quellan existed partially in another dimension and were only partly visible to normal sight. Getting all these species into the same room and actually talking to each other was a logistical nightmare. The Concordat negotiators, who were accustomed to dictating terms to defeated enemies in quiet, dignified settings, found themselves in what could only be described as controlled chaos. Humans had set up the conference like one of their democratic assemblies, where everyone got to speak and vote on major decisions. Translators worked overtime, converting between dozens of languages. Arguments broke out constantly as species with ancient grievances against each other tried to settle old scores. At one point, a fight almost erupted between two delegations until human security stepped in. But somehow, through all the chaos and confusion, it worked. Every species got their voice heard. Every concern was addressed. The humans moderated the discussions with what they called aggressive friendliness. They were warm, welcoming, and absolutely refused to let anyone dominate the conversation or bully smaller species. When the Concordat negotiators tried to object to certain terms, they found themselves facing a united front of 40 species who all agreed that yes, these terms were fair and no, there would be no further negotiations. As the final documents were being prepared for signing, one of the HFY observers approached Admiral Rebecca Stone, who had been leading the human delegation. The crystalline being's voice resonated through its translation device. "Your species is terrifying," it said, and Admiral Stone tensed, expecting criticism. But the HFY continued, "Not because of your weapons or your tactics, but because you fight wars like you actually want them to end." Rebecca Stone smiled tiredly. She had barely slept in weeks, coordinating the massive peace conference while also managing ongoing military operations and humanitarian assistance to freed worlds. "We've had practice," she said simply. "We spent 10,000 years fighting each other before we finally got it through our thick skulls that cooperation beats domination. We're just enthusiastic about sharing that lesson now." The HFY tilted its crystalline structure in what might have been a nod. Most species fight to win. You fight to change the rules entirely. Stone nodded. What's the point of winning if the system that caused the war is still in place? Someone else will just start the next war. Better to fix the whole mess while we have the chance. The peace accord was signed by all parties. The Concordat's 3,000-year empire officially ended. But the real work was just beginning. The galaxy was left with a massive power vacuum. Dozens of species were suddenly independent but lacked the infrastructure, technology, or experience to govern themselves effectively. Pirates and warlords were already moving into undefended territories. The potential for chaos and new conflicts was enormous. Humanity could have filled that vacuum. They had the military power, the technology, and the organizational capability to rule the galaxy if they wanted. Many species expected them to do exactly that. But instead, humanity did something different. They established what they called a Galactic Federation, a truly cooperative alliance where every species, no matter how small or weak, had an equal voice in major decisions. The Federation wasn't perfect. Human bureaucracy, it turned out, was just as maddening as human warfare. There were endless committees, procedures, and forms to fill out. Getting anything done required consensus from dozens of species who often disagreed about everything. Progress was slow and frustrating, but it was better than the alternative. For the first time in galactic history, small species didn't have to fear being conquered. They had allies who would actually help them without demanding submission in return. A new saying began spreading through the galaxy, repeated in dozens of languages across countless worlds. Never start a war with humans. They've been preparing their entire evolutionary history, and they're disturbingly good at it. Young members of various species would ask their elders what it meant. The elders would tell them about the Great War, about how the mighty Concordat had fallen, about how the humans fought not just with weapons but with ideas. Ambassador Chris Williams heard this saying during a diplomatic function on a Verithin colony world. Someone had just finished telling the story of the war to a group of youngsters. Chris laughed and raised his glass. "That's true," he said, "but you should add something else to that saying." The room fell quiet, waiting to hear what wisdom the human ambassador would share. Chris grinned. "Also, we really hate bullies." The crowd laughed, but there was truth in the joke. Humanity had stumbled onto the galactic stage and immediately punched the biggest bully in the face. Now they were working to make sure no other species would have to suffer under that kind of oppression again. It wasn't because humans were inherently better or more moral than other species. It was simply because they had learned, through thousands of years of their own bloody history, that there was a better way. And having learned that lesson the hard way, they were determined to share it with everyone else, whether the galaxy was ready for it or not.